You probably don't need another recommendation for Jump Over the Ages 2022 indie darling Citizen Sleeper. This exceptional science fiction game has been thoroughly analysed and advocated by far more qualified writers who've delved deeply into its themes of transhumanism, identity, and living in the age of apocalypse. Personally, I thought I'd only ever appreciate Citizen Sleeper through passive writing, and avoid playing it myself. Not because of its synopsis, themes, or even its presentation, but instead preconceived genre expectations. For all intents and purposes, Citizen Sleeper is a tabletop-inspired role-playing game, and that's usually shorthand to mean the game is a digital version of Dungeons & Dragons. Released last year, Baldur's Gate 3 is the most apt example of that kind of RPG, especially as its design is indebted to the latest version of D&D. It's a grand fantasy adventure you're expected to play for dozens of hours, where thrilling action is dictated by character positioning, action points, and rolling giant dice. And the most exciting thing that can happen is passing a charisma check to generate new dialogue options. While undeniably impressive, Baldur's Gate 3 highlights why traditional RPGs don't appeal to me, because their focus on numbers and random chance feels too rigid. My distaste of D&D stands in spite of Game Mastering, a tabletop podcast for 2 seasons on this channel. The difference is I avoided D&D and instead ran a simplified version of Powered by the Apocalypse, a system that underpins games like the titular Apocalypse World, Monster of the Week, Spirit of 77, and Dungeon World. I chose PBTA over the more widely available D&D, so I didn't bog down guests in rules and mechanics, and gave them greater room to improvise. PBTA systems minimize numbers and use visuals to illustrate progress. They employ fail-forward mechanics where actions always have consequences instead of rigid success or failure, and they put players in control of shaping a plot's direction. This is why I finally decided to play Citizen Sleeper, not because of how great I heard it was, but instead after seeing something incredibly minor none of these previous pieces of writing picked up on. The game tracked progression with clocks, just like PBTA systems I recognised. Lead designer Gareth Damian Martin even said that its systems were inspired by the PBTA spin-off Blades in the Dark, a fantasy gang adventure that blends board game elements with traditional tabletop. Fortunately, like Blades, Citizen Sleeper is a board game that's never boring. When a player starts Citizen Sleeper, they'll be presented by clocks ticking up and down. Cast as a soul trapped in a decaying cybernetic frame, Citizen Sleeper is a story in the cyberpunk tradition of not saving the world, but saving yourself. A rather poignant metaphor, survival is tied directly to a medication that keeps this frame functioning, and that dictates how many activities are done in a cycle. At full health, players are randomly generated a currency of 6 dice that can be used to influence how activities unfold. To give a simple example, one of the main means to generate income that can be spent on medication is through doing salvage jobs. If a player decides to spend a 6 or 5 on this task, they pass it without complication and make some money. But spending a 3 or 4 may throw a complication into the mix. Perhaps they raise suspicion, take harm that eats into survival, or even lock themselves out of doing this activity for a cycle. This strategy applies to almost every decision on the station, and as the game goes along, players will find themselves having to choose between their own immediate survival and helping out others to open new avenues of saving themselves. Fortunately, there are no truly bad results in Citizen Sleeper. Although a cycle may generate a strings of 1s and 2s, these can be spent doing digital spelunking through the station or even progressing safer activities. Through upgrades, dice can even be re-rolled or their effects improved. Rigid failures happen rarely, and their consequences open up new story paths. There's also no rigid adherence to a prescribed plot in Sleeper, and at any point a player can decide to spend their activity points where they're most interested in pursuing, opening entirely new branches to explore. Although there's still a focus on dice and decision making, Citizen Sleeper doesn't follow conventional RPG interface design. In fact, it can be played with nothing more than a pointer. Jump Over the Age eschewed from well-established game interfaces and embraced design more in common with iPad apps and web pages. The game itself would feel fantastic on a big touchscreen slate where you can scroll through this big rotating station, click on hotspots to visit new locations, tap in dialogue choices, and drag dice onto activities to progress clocks. As a result, I didn't burn out playing Citizen Sleeper, and could comfortably dig into its science fiction story. Because there are no immediate world-ending threats except for keeping the player frame alive, Sleeper is like a garden that can be tended to in short bursts. Cycles last only a few minutes but always lead to something interesting. My first playthrough was completed after a few hours and ended in a thematically touching way that I don't wish to spoil here. However, with gained experience, my second playthrough was far more involved, touching on almost every questline as to help everyone I could on the station. Citizen's greatest power fantasy isn't completing every quest perfectly, but it's when you have your own means to create medication and generate steady income. Something that many in our reality could only dream of. Digital versions of Dungeons & Dragons can still be weighed down by the baggage of that series mechanically and spiritually. Although new adventures break from gender norms and antiquated racial stereotypes, D&D's underlying mechanics are still exercises in conquest and power, born from its wargaming origins. While PBTA systems aren't a perfect substitute, many were created with the intent of subverting those tropes, to create stories that could be more queer, expressive, or grounded, giving them a greater empathy. Citizen Sleeper feels born from that same ethos, and like the best science fiction, is both a means for marginalized people to imagine a more freeing world to highlight flaws in our own society. This adventure isn't aimed only at seasoned RPG players looking to min-max, but instead could reach absolutely anyone, even those who may never have played a video game before. Citizen Sleeper uses its systems masterfully to illustrate that you're not playing as a super soldier expected of the genre, but instead you have to consider where you can give 110% on any given cycle. What initially begins as a story of short-term survival by doing social legwork for sheltered individuals, eventually blossoms into fuller stories where you discover the true generosity, loyalty, and tenacity of everyday people. Citizen Sleeper demonstrates that warmth isn't cast down from a distant star, but instead is found amongst those around you.